you're watching this, you're probably someone who's already pretty interested in the auto industry's transition from internal combustion to battery electric power. And unless you're new to the channel and you're into the habit of just letting the algorithm pick the next video on your playlist, you're probably also someone who's aware that we believe politics play an important part in everything we do, from the taxes we pay to the healthcare we receive, and so much more. So, if you're watching this, I'm going to assume that you're not going to get all angry from Argyle in the comments section and moan about us combining the world of politics and EVs. But just on the off chance you are, and you did let the algorithm pick the next video at random, hey, no judgment here. I woke up the other morning, no joke, to the full 2.5-hour uncut video of garlic bread being sent to the edge of space by Tom Scott. It was actually a pretty good video. I'm gonna give you 5 more seconds to click that button and escape. Your sensibilities saved. Still with me? Good. Okay, if you're watching now, then I'm going to assume that you're here for the actual video. Why electric vehicles and clean energy projects are going to have a pretty large role in this year's midterm elections in the US. I know, someone with a British accent talking about US politics. It's going to be so fun. But first, please click that subscribe button and hit the notification bell if you haven't already, and maybe we can brute force YouTube into actually notifying people about our videos again. Oh, and stick around until the end of the video when I'll tell you how you can support us. For those outside the US, let's grab a quick civics class before we delve into the EV and green energy implications of the midterms. But if you already know this, then just use the chapter markings below to skip to the next bit. We won't mind. While midterms might not seem as exciting as a US presidential election, they do have massive impacts on the president's agenda moving forwards. The US presidential election happens every 4 years, but state representatives serving in the House of Representatives have to be re-elected every 2 years, and senators must face re-election every 6 years, with approximately 1/3 of the Senate up for re-election every 2 years, because maths. Or math, because we're in America. The House of Representatives has a total of 435 seats, and the Senate a total of 100 seats. Technically, the US is a two-party system, although you can have independent candidates who run who are neither Republican nor Democrat, and midterms can dramatically change the political makeup of both houses, massively shifting the policies and priorities of the nation's government. Also important to know, unlike some countries where the party that wins the most recent election gets to have its leader assume the role of the country's leader, the US system allows for a situation where the president is from a different political party to the majority in either the House or the Senate, or in fact, both. If the president's party loses in the midterms, that can leave them in a difficult situation where they are unsupported by Capitol Hill, and it's hard to pass any legislation. Political gridlock. At a local level, midterms are the time when many states elect a new governor, not to mention hold elections for state, county and city governments, as well as things like school districts and other publicly held offices. And while the midterm elections aren't going to happen until November this year, if you're watching this video the day it's released, you should know that the first election in the midterm cycle, the Texas primaries, are taking place today, March 1st. Knowing who's running and how they view electric vehicles and clean energy is imperative to being an active participant in how the country is run. But picking the EV candidate doesn't necessarily mean voting Democrat. Instead, knowing the issues and how the candidates respond to them will help you make sure that whomever you vote for will be pro-EV and pro-clean energy policies. Civics 101 out of the way, let's drill down, because the House and Senate are currently at their most divided, with very little bipartisan cooperation and a very slim majority giving control to the Democrats. And what happens in the midterms could make it easier, or in fact harder, for electric vehicle and renewable energy policies to make it into law. Traditionally, Republican lawmakers and more conservative Democrats have been less likely to support pro-EV and pro-environmental legislation than more centrist and progressive Democrats. But not for the reasons you think. See, historically, while it's fair to say that electric vehicles have attracted bipartisan support, and I should add that fiscal conservatives are often big EV supporters thanks to the overall lower cost of ownership that EVs can offer, EVs have been traditionally more of a Democratic issue than a Republican one. Back in 2017, a study by Car Jojo stated that folks in states that voted for President Trump in the 2016 presidential election purchased far fewer electric vehicles than folks in states that did not. And in 2021, the roughly 57% of the population in states that voted for President Biden in the 2020 election held 76% of the nation's total EV sales. The survey data may paint a particularly stark picture, but there is some natural skewing of the stats. For example, urban areas are much more likely to vote Democrat than Republican. About 62% of urban voters lean Democrat, and 54% of rural voters lean Republican. And of course, while many people do live in rural areas and own electric cars, EV ownership is far more common in urban and suburban areas than in rural areas due to better EV charging infrastructure. However, that figure is also skewed by the fact that only 19% of the US population live in rural areas. But the policy differences between Republicans and Democrats are slowly but surely shifting. Senator Lindsey Graham, a Republican from South Carolina, has stated recently that, quote, "It's just a matter of time until most cars will be running on something other than gasoline," end quote. He's not alone, and many legislatures in traditionally red parts of the US are starting to consider programs to increase electric vehicle adoption and clean energy use. But measures traditionally used to encourage EV adoption and clean energy, carrots and sticks in the form of incentives and fines, have long been seen by many Americans, especially those who tend towards more conservative views, as meddling in matters that good old-fashioned capitalism should decide. Traditionally, the Republican Party has promoted itself on the idea of small government, a government that stays out of the hair of citizens with less regulation, lower spending, and lower taxes. As such, some Republican politicians suggest that policies like banning or limiting internal combustion engine sale or use, or imposing tough environmental protections are anti-business and/or anti-American, essentially restricting the choice that their constituents have and the so-called will of the free market. That said, some of those self-same legislators do also enact policies that restrict the choices of their constituents, but they tend towards culture war topics designed to appeal to their base. I think you know which topics I'm talking about. As President Biden's infrastructure bill made its way through Congress last year, opposition to it was based on both the cost of the bill and claims that it was part of a quote-unquote radical leftist agenda that included more than traditional infrastructure spending. In fact, the term socialism was bandied about on government funding of a nationwide EV charging network, but it was actually a concept that built on then-candidate Trump's campaign, which claimed climate change was a hoax, electric vehicles were a joke, and playthings of the coastal elite, and that LED light bulbs, as in some kind of nebulous way, were far worse than incandescent ones, and don't even get me started on the flushing of toilets. Anyway, all of this would take away the jobs of hard-working Americans, apparently. And that was all layered onto the worst element of modern politics, opposition to policies championed by the other party. Both parties do it, but in the case of EVs, it does tend to be a Republican opposition to Democratic policies. Unfortunately, being willfully contrary looks like it's sticking around as a trendy tactic. Then there are other issues that have an immediate impact, like the price of oil. In a world where inflation is heading skyward and where Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine and continued saber-rattling has pushed the price of oil well above $100 per barrel, most Americans, many of whom know absolutely nothing about the benefits of electric vehicles, just from a lack of exposure, want their weekly gas bill to be smaller. and before EVs are openly discussed and supported from both sides in equal measure, I expect pressure to be put on the White House and Democrats to first tackle inflation and the rising price of fossil fuels before electric vehicles are even discussed. And yes, that probably means drill baby drill. Let's also not forget that fossil fuel companies, from coal companies to big oil, and yes, auto dealer unions too, all spend massive amounts of money every year in political donations to candidates from both parties. And yes, lobbying pressure and campaign donations are suspected to be some of the reasons why Democratic Senator Joe Manchin took the line he did on recent attempts to pass the Build Back Better bill. He opposed it. It also happened to include significant EV incentives. That said, while some folk would like you to believe that anthropogenic climate change is a partisan issue, and it is fair to say that most extreme right politicians are more likely to label climate change a hoax and measures to tackle it as socialism, there are far more Republican politicians than there were who, away from the pressures of CPAC, acknowledge something needs to be done. The fact that the US military has been unequivocal in presenting climate change as a threat to national security really helps that. Which brings me to one of the biggest challenges of this election cycle when it comes to EVs and EV policies: misinformation. The US media has become increasingly partisan over the last few decades, and trust in the media varies greatly depending on personal political affiliation. In 2020, a study by Pew Research found that there was a major difference between the news sources trusted by people who identified as Democrat versus those who identify as Republican. 1/2 of the surveyed Democrats trusted at least 6 different news sources as being trustworthy, but just 1/2 of Republicans trusted one news source: Fox News. And as I'm sure you're aware, when you only get your news from just one source, things can become very polarised. Given that Fox News historically ran stories that portrayed electric cars in a negative light, although that has changed a little in recent years, it is no wonder that those who identify as being Republican are less likely to want to trust or own electric vehicles. But that's changing because of Elon Musk. Since the presidential election of 2020, Elon Musk has increasingly railed against the current administration. Some of his beef comes from the ridiculously long time it took the White House to acknowledge Tesla's part in helping transition the world to electric vehicles. In fact, the White House ignored Tesla's existence for months. It was embarrassing. It chose instead to paint General Motors as being the leader in EVs in the US. It was laughable, cringeworthy, and frustrating. But there have been other issues too. Musk has been vocal about vaccine and mask mandates, he's not a fan of them, and has come out in support of the quote-unquote Canadian trucker blockade over in Ottawa, Canada. He's railed against government agencies like the SEC and NHTSA, and he's given as good as he's got in fights with progressive Democrats over taxation policy. The TLDR is that Musk and many of Tesla's most ardent supporters are shifting hard towards libertarian and more conservative narratives. Some former Democrats are swearing off the party because of its collective treatment of Musk and Tesla, and many Republicans who previously perceived electric cars as an elite plaything are sitting up and taking notice of Musk's political posturing, and with them, his cars. I can't think of a better demonstration of this than a January survey from Morning Consult, which shows that more Republicans are likely to trust Tesla, 27%, than Democrats, 25%. Additionally, since December, the number of Republicans considering buying a Tesla has risen by 3%, from 14% in December to 17% in January. Essentially, in moving to Texas and leaning into certain issues, Tesla has become more acceptable to Republicans, and according to what they are saying on social media, has also put more hardened Tesla fans off voting Democrat and towards other alternatives. Given Elon Musk is currently opposed to the Build Back Better Act in its current form, that increased support Tesla has on the right could make for some interesting policies moving forwards. Which brings us to where? Well, the things you should bear in mind when getting ready for the midterms. And all of these tips apply to all candidates for everything from school board officials through to seats on Capitol Hill. First, be active. Research things before you head to the ballot box, both in terms of existing and proposed policy, but also in terms of the candidates' opinions on the topics you find important. Find out where they stand on issues surrounding clean cars and renewable energy, and know their backgrounds too. Are they in favour of high taxes or plug-in owners? Are they supported by the local auto dealer association or fossil fuel companies through big campaign donations? And if they are elected into office, what steps will they take to encourage people to buy an electric car or switch to a cleaner energy source? Ballotpedia and sites like it are a phenomenally good place to start when researching candidates, and most candidates will hold town halls or other open events where you can ask them questions on specific topics. Remember, candidates are there to represent their constituents, so don't be afraid to ask the tough questions to get the information you need to be that informed voter. Next, and this is super important, don't assume that a candidate from one party will be bad and the other good. Re Senator Manchin. It's up to you to examine all candidates from all parties and the policies and ideals of the party they represent. As in today's political fractured world, it's possible to have extreme views in either party that may or may not align with your own. This is especially true when it comes to primaries, where different candidates from the same party will be vying to be the chosen party's candidate in the November elections. That said, it's also important to weigh up both the candidates' views and the views of the party whose ticket they're running on. Because, particularly at the national level, it doesn't matter if the politician is pro-EV if the wider party they're aligned with isn't. After that, it's important to be able to talk to other people on the issues, help educate friends and family, and be respectful of everyone's opinions. Civil discourse is always preferable to shouting matches. Finally, and this is kind of important, make sure that you are actually registered to vote. If you want better support for plug-in vehicles, or you want to see your area make it easier to get solar panels, you need to play an active part in supporting the candidates you think will help you make that happen. Otherwise, you'll end up at home moaning about the things that you could have done something about, but you couldn't be asked to. And that's it for today. If you liked the video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to leave your thoughts below or in our free to join Discord chat room. There are links in the description. If you haven't already, make sure you've subscribed to this channel and to our other channel, Transport Evolved Take 2, and give that bell a gentle little ding to make sure you're told when our next video goes live. Thanks on behalf of the entire TE crew go out to the folk on my right for being our $15 to $49 a month supporters. Special thanks to our $50 a month patrons, that's Chris Maxwell, Bennett Elder, Brian Newton, Dave Kitchen, Michael Goad, Ricky Leon, Andrew Martin, Guido Drahota, Brophy Wolf, Tazlet and the Gong, Gordon C., Stephen O'Donoghue, Carl Hodgson, Anthony Coates, Regine Fellows, Rory Litwin, Anonymous Freak, Jim Burness, Zachary Courtney, Krista Cantavar, and Denny Hyde. And our deepest gratitude to our $100 a month Patreon supporters. They are Marcel Ward, Reggie Watts, Joe Bresney, JP Fagerback, Will Graylin, Matthew Drobnak, John Lyons, Christopher Lee Jones, Andrew Glenn, Paul Conway, Ellery Hennesley, and Ian. If you're feeling left out, you can join Patreon at the link below. You can click the join button on YouTube to become a channel member, or you can show us your support through Bitcoin, Ko-fi, or our cool swag store, and then we won't have to do another ad for a certain video game. Thanks for joining me, and as always, keep evolving!